Tonight, we begin with a journey into the heart of one of history's most remarkable urban achievements, Tenochtitlan, the magnificent island capital of the Aztec Empire. Before modern Mexico City spread its concrete fingers across the valley, before Spanish conquistadors arrived with their horses and steel, this city of canals and temples rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a dream made manifest. But make no mistake, for all its grandeur and innovation, life in Tenochtitlan was a daily struggle that would break most modern people within hours. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in the year 1500, not in your comfortable bed with its memory foam mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets, but on a simple reed mat in a modest adobe home in Tenochtitlan. The first light of dawn filters through the doorway covered by a simple cloth. Outside you can already hear the gentle splash of water against the chinampas, the remarkable floating gardens that feed the city, and the soft creak of wooden canoes gliding through the canals. The city is already stirring to life, for in Tenochtitlan, as in most ancient societies, life begins with the sun. Before we explore a typical day in this remarkable city, let's understand what makes Tenochtitlan so extraordinary. Founded in 1325, on a marshy island in Lake Texcoco, the city wasn't just built beside water, it was built within it, embracing the lake, rather than fighting against it. According to Aztec legend, their wandering tribe was instructed by their god, Huitzilopochtli, to settle where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. When they witnessed this sign on a small, unpromising island, they set to work transforming it into one of the greatest urban centres in the world. By the time of European contact in 1519, Tenochtitlan had grown to house between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time, larger than London, Paris, or any European city of the era. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés wrote to Emperor Charles V describing a city so vast and orderly that it seemed impossible with markets larger than those of Constantinople and infrastructure more advanced than much of Europe. The city was laid out in a meticulous grid pattern, with the sacred precinct at its centre housing the great temple or Templo Mayor, which rose in terraced steps toward the sky. From this ceremonial heart, 4 main causeways extended to the mainland, like compass points connecting the island to the wider world. These weren't simple dirt paths, but sophisticated engineering projects, wide elevated roadways with drawbridges that could be raised for defence or to allow boat traffic to pass. Smaller causeways and canals crisscrossed the city, creating a Venice-like network of water roads that served as the main transportation arteries. As a resident of Tenochtitlan, your day would begin early, typically before dawn. If you were an ordinary Mesehuel or commoner, you'd rise from your patate the woven reed mat that served as your bed. Your home would be relatively simple. A 1-story adobe structure with a thatched roof, perhaps with 2 main rooms. One room would serve as sleeping quarters for your family, while the other might function as living space and kitchen. If you were wealthy or of noble birth, your home would be larger, possibly 2 stories with stone foundations and plaster walls painted in vivid colours. Your first task would be personal hygiene, and here's where many modern visitors might be surprised. The Aztecs were fastidious about cleanliness. You would wash your face and hands using water from a clay pitcher, possibly with the aid of a soap-like substance made from the root of the Quetzalcoatl plant. The Aztecs bathed frequently, often twice daily, putting many Europeans of the same era to shame. Emperor Moctezuma II was said to bathe 4 times each day, changing his clothes with each bath and never wearing the same outfit twice. Speaking of clothes, your attire would be simple but practical. Men typically wore a loincloth called a maxtlatl, and a cloak or cape known as a tilmatli, which was tied at the shoulder. Women wore a long skirt called a queitl, and a sleeveless blouse or shift called a huipili. Clothing was made primarily from cotton for the upper classes and maguey fibre for commoners, often with colourful designs that indicated your social status and community role. Going barefoot was common for the lower classes, while sandals made from maggi fiber, leather or rubber were worn by those of higher status. After dressing, it would be time for the first meal of the day. Breakfast would be simple, perhaps some tamales or atol, a warm cornmeal drink that could be flavoured with chili honey or fruit. The staple of the Aztec diet was maize or corn prepared in countless ways, from tortillas to complex dishes. This would be complemented by beans, squash, chili peppers, tomatoes, and a variety of fruits. Meat was less common, though those who could afford it might enjoy turkey, duck, or dog. Yes, dog, which was raised specifically for food and considered a delicacy. With breakfast finished, your workday would begin, and this is where your experience would differ dramatically based on your social status. Aztec society was highly stratified, with a clear hierarchy from the emperor down to slaves. Most people fell into the commoner class, working as farmers, craftspeople, or merchants. If you were a farmer, you might head to the Chainan Pass, those remarkable floating gardens that sustained the city. These weren't truly floating, rather they were artificial islands created by piling mud from the lake bottom onto mats of woven reeds, creating small but incredibly fertile plots. These Chainampas were the agricultural miracle that allowed Tenochtitlan to feed its massive population despite limited land. They produced multiple harvests each year, growing maize beans, chili peppers, tomatoes, and various flowers. Working the Chainampas was labour-intensive. You'd use simple tools, wooden digging sticks, stone or copper-bladed hoes, and woven baskets for carrying soil and harvests. You'd spend your day planting, weeding, irrigating, and harvesting, often working alongside family members. The work was physically demanding but productive. The Chainampas were among the most efficient agricultural systems ever devised, producing enough surplus to feed a massive urban population. If you weren't a farmer, you might be a craftsperson, a weaver, potter, goldsmith, featherworker, or any number of specialized trades that flourished in the city. The Aztecs were skilled artisans, creating objects of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Featherwork was particularly valued, with artisans creating stunning mosaics and garments from brilliantly coloured parrot, quetzal, and hummingbird feathers. Merchants or potteca formed another vital class. If you belonged to this group, you might spend your day at one of Tenochtitlan's bustling markets, the largest being at Tlatelolco, the sister city that had been absorbed into Tenochtitlan. This grand marketplace allegedly served 60,000 people daily, according to Spanish accounts, with vendors arranged by category, selling everything from food and textiles to luxury goods, pottery tools, medicine and slaves. The market operated with a sophisticated system. Cacao beans served as currency for smaller purchases, while Quactly standardized cotton cloaks and copper or gold pieces were used for larger transactions. Officials enforced fair trade practices and judges settled disputes on the spot. The market wasn't just a place of commerce, but a social hub where news was shared, announcements were made, and community life unfolded. If you were among the noble class, the pivot in your day might involve government administration, religious duties, or military responsibilities. The Aztec Empire was a complex political entity requiring extensive bureaucracy to manage. Nobles served as judges, tax collectors, military leaders, and religious functionaries. At the very top of society stood the Tlatoani, or emperor, who ruled with absolute authority but was supported by a council of high-ranking nobles. Regardless of your station, by midday the sun would be high overhead and it would be time for the main meal of the day. This might be taken at home, or if you were in the market or otherwise away from food vendors selling prepared meals. The afternoon would bring a continuation of the morning's work, perhaps with a shift in activities as the heat of the day passed. As daylight began to fade, you'd wrap up your work and prepare for evening. Water was a constant presence in Tenochtitlan, both practically and spiritually. The city's sophisticated water management system included aqueducts bringing fresh spring water from Chapultepec on the mainland. This water wasn't primarily for drinking, the lake itself provided that, but for cleaning and bathing. If you could afford it, you might visit a Temazcalia sweat bath, similar to a sauna used for both hygiene and ritual purification. These dome-shaped structures were heated by hot stones, creating steam when water was poured over them. The Temazcali was especially important for pregnant women and for healing various ailments. The evening meal would again center around maize beans and chilies, the Aztec trinity of staple foods. You might enjoy a stew or soup flavored with native herbs and spices. If you were wealthy, your meal might include chocolate, Not the sweet treat we know today, but a bitter, frothy drink often mixed with chili pepper, and considered a luxury reserved for the elite and warriors. As night fell, lighting was limited. Homes might have small ceramic lamps burning pine resin or beeswax, but many activities simply ceased with the darkness. Families would gather, perhaps telling stories or planning for the next day. Children might play with simple toys, clay figures, small balls, or miniature tools that prepared them for adult roles. Sleep came early for most, though the city never fully quieted. Guards patrolled the streets and canals. Priests performed nighttime rituals at the temples, and some craftspeople, particularly those working with fire like metalsmiths, might continue their work into the night hours. This daily rhythm would be punctuated by the Aztec calendar, which governed not just the days, but the spiritual cadence of life. 2 calendrical systems operated simultaneously, a 260-day ritual calendar, tonal pohuali, and a 365-day solar calendar, siu pohuali. Together they created a 52-year cycle that shaped Aztec ceremonial life. Religious observances were woven into daily existence. The Aztec pantheon included hundreds of deities, each governing different aspects of the natural and spiritual worlds. Huitzilopochtli, the war and sun god, and Tlaloc, the rain deity, were particularly important, with both having shrines atop the great temple. Their worship wasn't confined to priests. Everyone participated in religious rituals as part of ordinary life. And here we must confront the aspect of Aztec society that has most captured the modern imagination: human sacrifice. While often sensationalized, and exaggerated ritual sacrifice was indeed a genuine feature of Aztec religious practice. It was rooted in their cosmology, which held that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and humanity, and that human sacrifice was necessary to repay this debt and ensure the continuation of the world. The practice varied widely in scale and method. Most common were heart extraction rituals performed atop temple pyramids. The victim would be stretched across a stone altar, and a priest would use an obsidian knife to cut into the chest and remove the still beating heart, which would be placed in a ceremonial vessel. The body would then be rolled down the temple steps. Other forms included gladiatorial sacrifice, where captured warriors fought against Aztec knights, decapitation, drowning, burning, and flaying. The scale of sacrifices has been debated. Some Spanish accounts claim thousands of victims for special occasions, such as the dedication of the Great Temple under Ahuitzotl in 1487, but these numbers may be exaggerated. Archaeological evidence, including skull racks Tzompantli discovered in Tenochtitlan, confirms the practice was significant, but perhaps not as massive as colonial sources suggested. It's important to understand that human sacrifice wasn't viewed as murder by the Aztecs, but as a sacred responsibility. Many victims were war captives, and being sacrificed was considered an honourable death that guaranteed passage to a desirable afterlife. Some sacrificial roles, particularly those where individuals impersonated deities for up to a year before their sacrifice, were seen as positions of tremendous honour. This brings us to another crucial aspect of Aztec life: warfare. The Aztec Empire expanded through military conquest, and martial prowess was highly valued. Young men were trained for combat from childhood, and military service was a primary path to social advancement for commoners. Warfare followed specific patterns, often focused on capturing enemies for sacrifice rather than killing them in battle. The so-called Flower Wars, Xochitllan, were ceremonial conflicts arranged with neighbouring states, specifically to obtain sacrificial victims and to train warriors. These were distinct from conquests aimed at expanding territory or putting down rebellions. Success in warfare brought prestige, with accomplished warriors gaining the right to wear distinctive clothing and insignia marking their achievements. As a resident of Tenochtitlan, you would have experienced a paradoxical society, one capable of breathtaking artistic achievements, sophisticated urban planning, and complex philosophical thought, yet also engaged in practices that seem brutal by modern standards. But this paradox is true of many historical societies, including those from which our own emerged. The city's organisation reflected this complexity. Tenochtitlan was divided into 4 main quarters, each further subdivided into kalpuli, which functioned as administrative districts. Each kalpuli had its own temples, schools and land, which was distributed among its members. The kalpuli served as the basic social unit beyond the family, providing education, military organisation, tax collection and religious observances. Education was formalised and varied by social class. Noble children attended the Kalmakak, where they studied history, religion, astronomy, law, and leadership under the tutelage of priests. Commoner children typically went to the Telpochkali, which emphasized practical skills and military training. Girls received education at home or in special schools, learning domestic skills, crafts, religious practices, and sometimes specialized knowledge like midwifery or healing. Law and justice were strictly enforced. The Aztec legal code covered a wide range of offenses from theft and adultery to public drunkenness and disrespect toward elders. Punishments were typically severe, including death for major crimes like murder, treason, theft of sacrificial objects, or adultery involving a noble woman. Lesser offences might result in enslavement, confiscation of property, or public humiliation. Healthcare combined practical medicine with spiritual healing. Aztec physicians or Tenochtitlan were knowledgeable about hundreds of medicinal plants and surgical techniques. They set bones, treated wounds, and assisted in childbirth. Disease was understood as an imbalance that could have both natural and supernatural causes, so treatment often combined herbal remedies with prayers and rituals. As impressive as daily life in Tenochtitlan was, the city's grandeur depended on a system of tribute that extended far beyond its island boundaries. The Aztec Empire wasn't a centralized state in the modern sense, but a collection of city-states that paid tribute to the triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, with Tenochtitlan as the dominant partner. The tribute system was meticulously organized and recorded. Conquered territories were required to make regular payments of goods according to their local resources and specialties. These included basic commodities like maize beans and cotton, as well as luxury items like jade gold, exotic feathers, and cacao. Tribute wasn't just economic, but symbolic, representing the subjugation of conquered peoples. Officials known as Kalpixke were responsible for collecting tribute and ensuring compliance from conquered territories. The tribute flowed into Tenochtitlan, supporting its elaborate lifestyle and enabling its rulers to reward nobles, priests, and distinguished warriors with luxury goods and privileges. This system created resentment among subject peoples, which would later prove fatal when the Spanish arrived and found ready allies among those eager to overthrow Aztec dominance. Tenochtitlan's physical appearance would have astounded first-time visitors. The city rose from the lake waters, its white-plastered buildings gleaming in the sun. Wide, straight streets formed an orderly grid intersected by canals where canoes carried people and goods. The central ceremonial precinct contained not just the Great Temple, but dozens of other religious structures, administrative buildings, and palaces. The Emperor's Palace was particularly impressive, a sprawling complex with hundreds of rooms, gardens, aviaries housing exotic birds, and even a zoo with animals from across the empire. Nearby stood armories, courts of justice, and the quarters of high-ranking officials and priests. Outside the ceremonial centre, residential districts spread outward with housing quality diminishing with distance from the centre. The city's edge featured the Chinampus, creating a productive greenbelt around the urban core. The overall impression was of a planned, orderly metropolis that utilised its island setting to maximum advantage. Water management was critical to Tenochtitlan's success. Beyond the Chinampas, the Aztecs built dikes and causeways that regulated water levels and protected against flooding. The most significant was a massive dike nearly 10 miles long built under the Emperor Itzcoatl, which separated the brackish eastern waters of Lake Texcoco from the fresher western section where Tenochtitlan stood. This created a controlled environment that allowed for safer navigation, better fishing, and protection from flooding. Fresh water came to the city via the Chapultepec Aqueduct, a remarkable engineering achievement built during the reign of Moctezuma I. This double-channeled structure carried spring water from the mainland to the island, ensuring a reliable supply for drinking, cooking, and bathing. It remained functional until deliberately destroyed during the Spanish siege of 1521. Despite these achievements, life in Tenochtitlan had its challenges. The island location, while defensible, limited expansion and required constant maintenance of infrastructure. Flooding remained a threat despite extensive preventive measures. Sanitation posed problems, although the Aztecs developed relatively sophisticated waste management systems, including public toilets and waste collection boats that removed refuse from the city. Natural disasters, particularly earthquakes common to the region, posed serious threats to the city's structures. The relatively light construction of most buildings limited earthquake damage, but the city's water control systems were vulnerable to disruption, potentially leading to flooding or loss of freshwater access. Food security depended on the continued productivity of the Chinampus and the steady flow of tribute from conquered territories. Any disruption to these systems, whether from rebellion, drought, or other factors, could quickly threaten the city's stability. These challenges were manageable in normal times, but they would prove catastrophic when combined with European invasion. When Hernán Cortés and his small force of conquistadors arrived in 1519, they found a magnificent city that impressed even Europeans familiar with Rome and Constantinople. Yet, within 2 years, Tenochtitlan would fall, its remarkable urban achievements largely destroyed. The conquest wasn't accomplished by Spanish arms alone. Cortés skillfully exploited existing tensions within the Aztec tribute system, allying with subject peoples who resented Aztec rule, particularly the Tlaxcalans' longtime enemies of the Aztecs. He also benefited from internal political divisions within Tenochtitlan itself. But perhaps the most devastating weapon wasn't carried by Spanish soldiers, but travelled invisibly in their wake: disease. The smallpox epidemic that struck Tenochtitlan in 1520-1521 ravaged a population with no previous exposure or immunity. It killed vast numbers, including the Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had succeeded Moctezuma II after the latter's death during the initial Spanish occupation. The disease spread rapidly through the densely populated city. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piling up faster than they could be buried or cremated. Between 30% and 50% of the city's population may have died from smallpox alone, devastation that went far beyond the direct casualties of warfare. The epidemic coincided with the Spanish siege, which cut off the city's fresh water supply and blocked food deliveries. The combined effects of disease, starvation, and warfare finally broke Aztec resistance. On August 13, 1521, after months of fighting, Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish and their indigenous allies. The aftermath was devastating. Much of the city was destroyed during the fighting, with many of its temples and palaces deliberately demolished. The Spanish built their new capital, Mexico City, directly atop the ruins, using stones from Aztec buildings for their own constructions. The lake that had sustained Tenochtitlan was gradually drained over the following centuries, fundamentally altering the environment that had made the Aztec capital possible. Yet despite this destruction, elements of Aztec culture survived. Many aspects of indigenous life continued under Spanish rule, though transformed by Catholic influence and European technologies. The descendants of Tenochtitlan's inhabitants preserved memories of the city's grandeur, passing down stories, knowledge, and practices that have endured to the present day. Today, archaeological excavations in Mexico City continue to uncover remnants of Tenochtitlan, providing new insights into this remarkable urban achievement. The foundations of the Great Temple, discovered in 1978, can now be visited in the heart of Mexico's modern capital. Artifacts from the city are preserved in museums, and traditional practices derived from Aztec culture remain part of Mexican identity. The legacy of Tenochtitlan is complex, a story of remarkable achievement ended by conquest and disease, yet with cultural continuities that have persisted across 5 centuries. Understanding the daily life of this floating city helps us appreciate not just what was lost, but what endured and evolved into the present. As night falls on our exploration of ancient Tenochtitlan, imagine once more that you're there on a quiet evening in this city of water and stone. The lake waters lap gently against the Chinampus. Canoes slide silently through the canals. Temple fires burn against the darkening sky. In houses throughout the city, families gather, sharing the day's experiences, planning for tomorrow, unaware that their way of life would soon face its greatest challenge, and that 5 centuries later, people would still be telling their story, marveling at what they created on a small, unpromising island in Lake Texcoco, where an eagle once perched on a cactus devouring a snake. And now, as we leave the floating gardens and temple pyramids behind, let your mind drift with the canoes on the gentle waters of Lake Texcoco, carrying you into dreams of a city that once was, and in many ways still is. Part 2: Mozart's Mysterious Final Year. As we drift from the ancient canals of Tenochtitlan, let's journey to 18th century Vienna, where the final year in the life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart unfolds as one of music's most enduring mysteries. The year 1791 began with promise for the 35-year-old composer. but would end with his premature death amid swirling rumours, financial troubles, and a burst of almost supernatural creativity that has puzzled historians for centuries. It was January 1791, and Mozart had just enjoyed moderate success with his opera Così fan tutte. Though not immediately the triumph it would later become, it had at least brought some income to his perpetually strained finances. The previous few years had been difficult for Mozart. His popularity in Vienna had waned, concert revenues had diminished, and he had been forced to borrow money from friends. His letters from this period reveal a man increasingly anxious about his financial situation. Yet Mozart's personal life showed some signs of stability. His marriage to Constanze Weber had weathered difficult times, including the deaths of 4 of their 6 children. Only 2 boys, Carl Thomas and Franz Java, had survived infancy. In early 1791, Constanze was pregnant again, expecting their 6th child in the summer. Mozart remained a devoted, if sometimes absent, husband and father. The composer's living situation reflected his complicated financial circumstances. He and his family had moved frequently throughout Vienna, trying to balance his need for respectable accommodations with their precarious finances. By 1791, they had settled in an apartment in the Rauhensteingasse, not far from St. Stephen's Cathedral in central Vienna. The apartment was pleasant but not luxurious, a reflection of a man who earned substantial sums throughout his career but spent just as liberally. Mozart's daily routine during this period typically involved composing in the morning, teaching lessons to students from wealthy families in the afternoon, and often performing or attending social gatherings in the evening. He was known to stay up late into the night, returning to composition after an evening's socializing. This punishing schedule may have contributed to his chronically poor health. January and February passed relatively quietly. Mozart continued teaching and composing, including work on a string quintet K614 and other smaller pieces. But March brought a significant development, the arrival in Vienna of Emanuel Schikaneder, an actor, singer and theatrical entrepreneur who would play a pivotal role in Mozart's final months. Schikaneder was the director of the Theatre auf der Wieden, a suburban theatre that catered to ordinary Viennese citizens rather than the aristocracy. He proposed that Mozart compose the music for a new German-language opera, Die Zauberflöte, the Magic Flute, with a libretto by Schikaneder himself. The opera would be filled with Masonic symbolism. Both men were Freemasons and would combine elements of fairy tale magical adventure and philosophical allegory. Mozart agreed, perhaps seeing an opportunity to reconnect with a broader audience. Work on the Magic Flute would continue throughout the spring and summer, but it would soon be interrupted by other even more pressing commissions. In mid-July, Mozart received a mysterious visit that would become the subject of endless speculation. A grey messenger, an unidentified man dressed in grey, appeared at his door with a commission for a Requiem Mass. The patron insisted on anonymity, offering a generous payment with half the fee in advance. Mozart, always in need of money, accepted without hesitation. What Mozart didn't know was that the messenger represented Count Franz von Walsegg-Stupach, an aristocrat who had commissioned the Requiem to honour his recently deceased wife. The Count had a habit of commissioning works anonymously and then passing them off as his own compositions when performed at private gatherings, a practice not entirely uncommon among aristocratic music enthusiasts of the time. But to Mozart, already feeling physically unwell and psychologically fragile, the mysterious commission took on an almost supernatural significance. According to accounts later shared by Constanze, Mozart became convinced he was writing his own Requiem, that the grey messenger was an emissary from the afterlife. This eerie commission was soon interrupted by yet another urgent request. In July, Mozart was commissioned to compose an opera, La Clemenza di Tito, the Clemency of Titus, for the coronation of Leopold II as King of Bohemia in Prague. With barely 6 weeks to complete the work before its scheduled premiere on September 6th, Mozart threw himself into the composition, working at a feverish pace. August was a month of personal upheaval and professional pressure. Constanze gave birth to their 6th child, a son named Franz Xaver Wolfgang Mozart, on July the 26th. Shortly thereafter, she left Vienna to take the waters at Baden for her post-pregnancy recovery, leaving Mozart alone to cope with his crushing workload. He completed La Clemenza di Tito in an astonishing 18 days, though he delegated some of the recitative sections to his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr. In early September, Mozart travelled to Prague for the premiere of La Clemenza di Tito. The opera received a lukewarm reception, with Empress Maria Louisa reportedly dismissing it as German rubbish. This lukewarm response must have been disappointing to Mozart, but he had no time to dwell on it. He rushed back to Vienna for the premiere of The Magic Flute on September 30th. Unlike La Clemenza di Tito, The Magic Flute was an immediate popular success, though critics were initially puzzled by its blend of low comedy and high-minded philosophy. Mozart attended many of the early performances, delighting in the audience's positive reaction. It would eventually become one of his most beloved works and would be performed over 100 times in the year following its premiere, a remarkable run for the period. With The Magic Flute successfully launched, Mozart turned his attention back to the Requiem, but his health, which had been deteriorating throughout the summer, now took a decisive turn for the worse. In late November, he became bedridden with swelling pain and vomiting. The exact nature of his final illness has been the subject of extensive speculation. Theories have ranged from rheumatic fever, influenza, and trichinosis to mercury poisoning, kidney failure, and even poisoning by a jealous rival. Though this last theory is now largely discredited. Aware that his condition was grave, Mozart focused his remaining energy on completing the Requiem. He worked from his bed, often with Süssmayr by his side, taking notes and receiving instructions. As his strength failed, he reportedly attempted to sing parts of the Requiem with friends who had gathered at his bedside for a small performance of the work in progress. On December 5th, 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died just shy of his 36th birthday. The Requiem remained unfinished. The completed sections included the introit and Kyrie portions of the sequence and offertorium and sketches for other movements. Süssmayr would later complete the work based on Mozart's sketches and verbal instructions, though the extent of Mozart's input into the completed sections remains a subject of debate. Mozart's funeral reflected his diminished financial circumstances rather than his artistic stature. He received a third-class burial at St. Mark's Cemetery outside Vienna in an unmarked grave, not due to poverty as is sometimes claimed, but because this was the standard burial practice for Vienna's middle class at the time. Individual markers were rare and graves were reused after 10 years. The day of his funeral was cold and stormy, and few mourners attended the brief ceremony. In death, as sometimes in life, Mozart was ahead of his time. While appreciated by knowledgeable contemporaries, the full significance of his contributions to Western music would only be fully recognized in the decades following his death. His remarkable final year, which produced not only The Magic Flute and the Requiem, but also La Clemenza di Tito, the Clarinet Concerto, and several smaller works, represented a burst of creativity that has few parallels in musical history. The mystery of Mozart's death spawned numerous theories and legends. The most persistent, popularized by Peter Schaffer's play and film, Amadeus, involves Antonio Salieri, a successful composer and imperial Kapellmeister, who, according to the legend, was consumed by jealousy of Mozart's superior talent. In this fictional account, Salieri poisoned Mozart while commissioning the Requiem under disguise. This compelling narrative makes for excellent drama but poor history. In reality, Salieri and Mozart were professional rivals but not deadly enemies. Salieri even supported Mozart's son after his death and expressed admiration for Mozart's work. No contemporary evidence suggests foul play in Mozart's death. The true mystery of Mozart's final year lies not in the circumstances of his death, but in the extraordinary burst of creativity that preceded it. How did a man in failing health, burdened by financial worries and rushing between multiple major commissions, produce some of the most profound music ever written? Perhaps the answer lies in Mozart's lifelong capacity for composition under any circumstances. From childhood, he had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to compose quickly and with little need for revision. His manuscripts show remarkably few corrections, as if the music arrived in his mind fully formed. This facility, combined with the urgency of failing health, may explain the outpouring of masterworks in his final months. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Mozart may have sensed his approaching end and felt driven to complete as much as possible of the music still within him. The Requiem in particular seems to reflect a composer confronting mortality, his own and humanity's, with unflinching directness yet transcendent beauty. In the weeks following Mozart's death, memorial services were held throughout Europe. His unfinished Requiem, completed by Susmayer, received its first performance in January 1793 at a benefit concert for Constanza and her children. The young widow faced significant financial challenges, but proved remarkably resourceful. She organised concerts of her husband's music, pursued publishing deals for his manuscripts, and eventually secured a pension from the emperor. Constanza's efforts to preserve and promote her husband's legacy proved successful. In the decades following Mozart's death, his reputation grew steadily. The Romantic era embraced him as the epitome of natural genius, a divine vessel through whom music of celestial beauty flowed. By the mid-19th century, Mozart's position in the pantheon of Western music was secure. Today, more than 2 centuries after his death, Mozart's music remains ubiquitous in concert halls, recordings, and popular culture. The works of his final year, particularly the Magic Flute and the Requiem, rank among the most frequently performed compositions in the classical repertoire. Their enduring appeal testifies to the extraordinary achievement of a composer who, even as his physical strength failed, created works of unparalleled beauty and depth. The story of Mozart's final year resonates beyond music history because it touches on universal human themes: the race against mortality, the drive to complete one's life work, the contrast between worldly struggles and transcendent achievement. In his last months, Mozart lived with an intensity that both reflected and defied his approaching end. The works of 1791 show a composer at the height of his powers, synthesizing diverse influences into a uniquely personal voice. The Magic Flute combined popular theatre with profound philosophical and spiritual themes. The Requiem merged ancient liturgical traditions with a dramatic expressiveness that looked forward to the Romantic era. Even the more conventional La Clemenza di Tito showed Mozart's ability to breathe new life into the formal constraints of opera seria. What makes these achievements particularly remarkable is the speed with which they were accomplished. Mozart composed at a pace that would exhaust most musicians, often working on multiple major pieces simultaneously. During the summer of 1791, he was juggling the Magic Flute, La Clemenza di Tito, and the beginnings of the Requiem, all while teaching students and dealing with his wife's pregnancy and subsequent recuperation. This superhuman productivity came at a cost. Mozart had never been robust, suffering throughout his life from various illnesses that medical historians have struggled to diagnose definitively. The punishing workload of his final year, combined with financial stress and possibly pre-existing health conditions, likely contributed to his final decline. Mozart's relationship with Constanza during this period provides a touching counterpoint to his professional exertions. Despite their financial difficulties and the strain of his heavy workload, contemporary accounts suggest a relationship of genuine affection and mutual support. During her recovery in Baden, Mozart visited her whenever his work permitted, and their letters show continuing tenderness despite the pressures they faced. Constanza would later play a crucial role in shaping how Mozart was remembered. After his death, she carefully managed his unpublished manuscripts and commissioned the completion of unfinished works, including the Requiem. She worked with publishers to produce complete editions of his compositions and collaborated with early biographers to establish the narrative of his life and career. These efforts were not merely sentimental but practical. Constanza had 2 young sons to support, and Mozart's manuscripts represented a significant asset. Her business acumen ensured not only her family's financial security, but also the preservation of works that might otherwise have been lost or forgotten. Constanza's second marriage in 1809 to the Danish diplomat Georg Nicholas von Nissen furthered Mozart's legacy in unexpected ways. Von Nissen shared his wife's commitment to preserving Mozart's reputation and began work on a biography that, though unfinished at his death, would provide valuable first-hand information from Constanza about Mozart's life and character. Constanza outlived her famous first husband by nearly 50 years, dying in 1842 at the age of 80. Throughout that time, she witnessed the transformation of Mozart from a respected but sometimes struggling composer to an immortal figure in Western culture. The mythologizing had begun even before her death, with early biographers emphasizing the contrast between Mozart's sublime music and his mundane struggles. This mythologizing would accelerate throughout the 19th century. The Romantic era, with its cult of tortured genius, found in Mozart's story the perfect embodiment of art transcending worldly circumstances. Writers and musicians elaborated on the circumstances of his death, often embellishing details for dramatic effect. The grey messenger became a spectral figure, the Requiem a premonition of death, Salieri a villain consumed by jealousy. These narratives captured the imagination but obscured the historical reality of Mozart's final year, a period of extraordinary productivity amid ordinary human challenges. The 1791 Mozart was neither a carefree spirit nor a tormented soul, but a professional musician racing to fulfill commissions, provide for his family, and express his musical ideas before time ran out. What makes Mozart's final year truly remarkable is not the mysterious circumstances of his death, but the astonishing quality and quantity of the music he created while his health failed. The clarinet concerto, composed in October for his friend Anton Stadler, remains one of the most beloved works in the instrument's repertoire, its poignant adagio suggesting both serenity and unspoken sorrow. The magic flute, with its mix of fairy tale elements, Masonic symbolism, and profound humanity, represented a new kind of German opera that would influence composers from Beethoven to Wagner. Its accessible melodies and cosmic themes made it immediately popular with Viennese audiences, while containing depths that musicians and scholars continue to explore centuries later. The Requiem, even in its incomplete form, stands as one of the most powerful expressions of mortality in Western music. From the ominous opening measures to the pleading lacrimosa, the last section, Mozart is believed to have worked on the work conveyed both the terror of death and the hope of transcendence. That Mozart composed it while facing his own mortality adds a layer of poignancy that transcends historical interest. As we consider Mozart's final year, we're confronted with the inadequacy of simple narratives to capture the complexity of creative achievement. Was Mozart driven by premonitions of death, financial necessity, professional ambition, or simply the unstoppable flow of musical ideas that had characterized his entire career? The answer is likely all of these and more. A reminder that great art emerges from the full spectrum of human experience, from the mundane to the transcendent. The mystery of Mozart's death, the precise medical cause, the circumstances of his burial, the completion of the Requiem, may never be fully resolved. But perhaps the real mystery lies in the miracle of the music itself. How in a single year one man could create works of such variety, depth, and lasting beauty. As we lie here in the darkness, imagining Mozart in his final months, sometimes bedridden, but still humming melodies, sometimes at the keyboard working out passages of the Requiem, sometimes attending performances of the magic flute and delighting in the audience's response, we encounter not just a historical figure, but a testament to the human capacity for creation, even in the face of mortality. Mozart's final year reminds us that life's brevity can lend it a particular intensity, and that our most lasting legacies may emerge when we sense time growing short. In just 35 years, Mozart created a body of work that continues to move, delight, and astonish listeners more than 2 centuries after his death. His final year represents not an ending, but a culmination, the flowering of a musical genius that neither financial hardship nor failing health could diminish. And so, as we drift towards sleep, perhaps we can imagine those last notes of the Lacrimosa written as Mozart's strength ebbed away, a musical testament that speaks across the centuries, reminding us of both our mortality and our capacity for creating beauty that outlasts us. In that paradox lies the true mystery and the enduring fascination of Mozart's final year. Part 3. Aboriginal Dreamtime Navigation. As the last echoes of Mozart's Requiem fade into silence, let's journey to an entirely different world, one where music and story served not just as art, but as essential tools for survival in one of Earth's most challenging landscapes. Long before European ships reached Australian shores, the Aboriginal peoples of this vast continent had developed a remarkable system of navigation and knowledge transmission that would allow them to thrive for over 65,000 years in environments ranging from scorching deserts to tropical rainforests. At the heart of this system was the concept of the dreamtime, or dreaming, a complex spiritual framework that connected people to land ancestors and each other through an intricate web of stories, songs, and ceremonies. Far from being simply myths or entertainment, these cultural elements formed a sophisticated knowledge system that encoded vital information about geography, resources, and survival. Imagine for a moment the challenge of navigating across Australia's immense interior without maps, compasses, GPS, or even written language. The continent spans nearly 3 million square miles, much of it arid desert where landmarks are subtle and water sources precious and far between. Yet, Aboriginal peoples traverse these landscapes with remarkable precision, sometimes covering hundreds of miles on seasonal journeys or for ceremonial gatherings. They accomplish this feat through what we might call songlines, ancestral tracks crisscrossing the continent, each one a narrative route encoded in song story and ceremony. These songlines were not physical paths marked on the ground, but rather memorized sequences that described the landscape in meticulous detail, noting every significant feature, water source and resource along the way. The term songline is an English approximation of a complex concept that varies among the hundreds of different Aboriginal language groups. In the Western Desert region, songlines might be called Chukurpa or Yukurapa, while in Arnhem Land they could be Wonga or Ungud, each term carrying nuances specific to that cultural group, but all referring to the interconnected system of dreaming tracks that map the continent. To understand how this system works, consider that each songline tells the story of a creator being, perhaps an ancestral kangaroo snake or other creature, who travelled across the land, creating geographical features as they went. The journey of this ancestral being becomes both a creation story and a practical map. By memorizing the song associated with this ancestor, an Aboriginal person learns not just spiritual knowledge, but a detailed itinerary. The genius of this system lies in its multisensory encoding. A songline's melody might rise and fall with the landscape mimicking the physical terrain. The rhythm might quicken or slow to indicate distance. Specific verses correspond to actual locations. A distinctive rock formation, a waterhole, a stand of food-bearing trees. The song literally sings the land into being, making it possible to navigate through unfamiliar territory by following the song's directions. These songlines were not isolated routes, but formed an interconnected network spanning the continent. A person might know their local songlines intimately, but would need to connect with people from neighbouring groups to travel farther. This created not just a navigational system, but a social network of knowledge exchange and mutual responsibility. When neighbouring groups met at the boundaries of their territories, they would exchange songs, temporarily trading portions of their dreamtime knowledge to allow safe passage. This practice ensured that no single person or group possessed the entire songline network, making it a communal treasure that required cooperation to fully utilise. The practical aspects of this knowledge system were ingeniously integrated with spiritual beliefs. The obligation to maintain and properly perform the songs and ceremonies associated with one's dreamtime ancestors was not just a religious duty, but an ecological responsibility. Proper care of the land required knowledge of its features, resources, and seasonal patterns, all encoded in dreamtime narratives. For example, a songline might describe the journey of an ancestral being during the creation time, mentioning specific plants they encountered. This information serves multiple purposes. It identifies edible species, indicates when they might be in season, provides clues about nearby water sources, and establishes the spiritual significance of these resources. All this information is bundled into a memorable narrative form that can be faithfully transmitted across generations without writing. The precision of this knowledge is remarkable. Studies have shown that songlines can accurately describe geographical features across vast distances, sometimes hundreds of miles beyond the territory typically inhabited by a particular group. This suggests that the knowledge was maintained with extraordinary fidelity over generations, despite never being written down. This navigational system was complemented by highly developed observational skills. Aboriginal peoples became expert readers of subtle environmental cues, the behaviour of animals, the flowering patterns of plants, the movement of celestial bodies, changes in wind patterns, cloud formations, and countless other indicators that might escape untrained observers. Consider the 5 seasons recognised by the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land, each identified by specific environmental changes rather than a fixed calendar. Du Luda pre-monsoon, Baramiri monsoon season, Mayaltha spear grass season, Midawa fruiting season, and Dara Tharamiri early dry season, each bringing different foods, weather patterns, and activities. Knowledge of these seasonal indicators was crucial for survival and was seamlessly integrated into dreamtime knowledge. The Aboriginal understanding of astronomy further enhanced their navigational abilities. Many Aboriginal groups develop sophisticated knowledge of the night sky using celestial bodies as both calendrical markers and directional guides. The positions of stars, particularly the Southern Cross, provided reliable directional information. The appearance of certain star formations signaled the availability of specific resources. For instance, when the Pleiades' seven sisters appeared in the sky, it might indicate that specific food sources were ready to harvest. This astronomical knowledge was again encoded in Dreamtime stories with star constellations, often representing ancestral beings whose earthly journeys corresponded to songlines. The night sky became another layer of the navigational map, particularly useful in the vast, relatively featureless expanses of Australia's interior. The integration of practical and spiritual knowledge is perhaps best illustrated by the concept of country in Aboriginal cultures. Unlike the Western concept of land as property, country is understood as a living entity with which people have reciprocal relationships and responsibilities. One belongs to country rather than owning it. Caring for country requires intimate knowledge of its features, resources and needs, all information embedded in Dreamtime knowledge. Navigation within one's country involves not just physical wayfinding, but maintaining proper relationships with the land and its spiritual dimensions. Moving through country means following protocols established in the Dreamtime, acknowledging significant sites and performing appropriate ceremonies or acknowledgements. This spiritual framework ensured that environmental knowledge was treated with appropriate respect and responsibility. The transmission of this navigational knowledge took place primarily through ceremony, song, dance, and oral instruction. Young people would gradually be introduced to increasingly complex levels of Dreamtime knowledge as they demonstrated readiness and maturity. Learning occurred not through abstract instruction, but through direct experience on country with elders pointing out features, demonstrating skills, and teaching relevant songs and stories in context. Art also played a crucial role in encoding and transmitting navigational knowledge. Traditional Aboriginal art, whether rock paintings, bark paintings, or ground designs, often represents Dreamtime journeys and landscapes from a mental map perspective, rather than a literal visual representation. These artworks serve as mnemonic devices, helping to preserve and recall the details of songlines and their associated knowledge. The sophistication of this knowledge system becomes even more impressive when we consider its antiquity. Aboriginal peoples have continuously occupied Australia for at least 65,000 years, making theirs the world's oldest living culture. The songline system likely evolved over tens of thousands of years, refined through countless generations of observation and experience. This long-term continuity allowed Aboriginal peoples to navigate not just space but time, adapting to dramatic environmental changes including ice ages, rising sea levels, and shifting climatic patterns. The Dreamtime narratives sometimes preserve memories of ancient geological events. Stories of coastal flooding, for instance, that may record sea level rises occurring over 7,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. The arrival of European colonizers in 1788 brought devastating disruption to this ancient knowledge system. Displacement from traditional lands, population collapse from disease and violence, and deliberate suppression of cultural practices all threatened the continuity of Dreamtime knowledge. When people could not access their country to perform ceremonies and teach younger generations, crucial links in the knowledge transmission chain were broken. Despite these immense challenges, many Aboriginal communities managed to preserve core elements of their navigational knowledge. Today, efforts to document, revitalise and continue these traditions are underway across Australia. Elders work with younger generations and sometimes with non-Aboriginal researchers to record songlines, traditional ecological knowledge and their associated navigational information. Modern technology has been enlisted in this preservation effort. GPS tracking of traditional walking routes, digital recording of songs and stories, and mapping projects that overlay Dreamtime knowledge with geographical information systems help bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary documentation methods. These efforts recognise that Aboriginal navigational knowledge has value not just as cultural heritage, but as a sophisticated understanding of Australia's environments. This knowledge system offers insights relevant to contemporary challenges. Aboriginal fire management practices, for instance, developed over millennia of careful observation and encoded in Dreamtime knowledge, are increasingly recognised as sophisticated environmental management techniques that can help address modern concerns about bushfire intensity and frequency. Similarly, Aboriginal identification of edible and medicinal plants, water sources in apparently barren landscapes, and sustainable harvesting practices, all knowledge embedded in songlines and dreaming stories, represent valuable ecological wisdom developed through millennia of close observation and adaptation. The Aboriginal navigational system reminds us that there are multiple ways of knowing and traversing the world. Western traditions have emphasized written maps, instruments, and technologies that externalize navigational knowledge. Aboriginal traditions internalize this knowledge through song story and intimate connection with the land. Both approaches have their strengths and both represent remarkable human achievements. As we lie here in the darkness, imagine for a moment trying to find your way across hundreds of miles of desert with nothing but songs in your memory and stars above to guide you. Imagine the depth of knowledge required to recognize subtle landscape features, to find water where none seems present, to time your journey with seasonal resources, and to maintain your connection to ancestral wisdom throughout. This vision of navigation as a holistic practice, embracing spiritual beliefs, ecological knowledge, social connections, artistic expression, and practical skills, offers a profound alternative to our often compartmentalized modern understandings. In a world increasingly mediated by GPS systems and digital maps, the Aboriginal songline tradition reminds us of the power of directly knowing the land, of carrying maps within rather than apart from ourselves, and of seeing navigation as not just movement through space, but participation in a living, storied landscape. As your consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine following a songline across the red earth of Central Australia, each verse bringing you closer to your destination, each landmark confirming your path, the stars wheeling overhead in patterns recognized by countless generations before you. A form of navigation that is simultaneously a journey through physical space, cultural memory, and spiritual landscape. Part 4, Medieval Monastery Scribes. As we drift from the ancient songlines of Australia's deserts, let's journey to a very different landscape. The cool stone halls of medieval European monasteries, where another form of knowledge preservation was taking place through the patient labour of scribes. In the shadowy scriptoria of these religious communities, men and sometimes women bent over parchment pages, carefully copying and illuminating texts that would form the bridge between ancient knowledge and the modern world. Long before printing presses, photocopiers, or digital reproduction, every book had to be copied entirely by hand. This painstaking work fell primarily to monastic scribes, monks and occasionally nuns, who dedicated their lives to preserving and reproducing texts deemed worthy of the tremendous effort required. Their work represents one of history's greatest acts of cultural preservation and transmission, taking place during centuries often mistakenly labelled as the Dark Ages. To understand the world of the medieval scribe, we must first travel back to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. As Roman civic institutions crumbled across Western Europe, literacy rates plummeted, and the infrastructure that had supported book production and library maintenance disappeared in many regions. Into this void stepped Christian monasteries, which gradually became the primary centres of literacy education and book production throughout much of medieval Europe. The typical day of a monastic scribe began early, as did all activities in medieval monasteries. The Benedictine rule, which governed many monastic communities, divided the day into periods of prayer work and study. For scribes, the work portion of this schedule would be spent in the scriptorium, a dedicated space for copying manuscripts usually located near the monastery library. Imagine walking into a 12th century scriptorium. The room might be arranged around the periphery of a cloister to maximize the available natural light. Windows would be positioned to capture northern light where possible, as this provided the most consistent illumination, without the harsh direct sunlight that could cast problematic shadows or damage delicate manuscript materials. In winter, or on darker days, the scriptorium would be lit by candles or simple oil lamps, their gentle flickering creating an atmosphere both serene and demanding of concentration. The furniture would be sparse but specialized. Scribes typically worked at angled writing desks or lecterns, designed to hold the exemplar, the text being copied at a convenient reading angle while providing a sloped surface for writing. The scribe would sit on a simple stool, often with no back support, hunched over his work in a posture that would eventually take its toll on the body. The tools of the scribe's trade were few but essential. The primary writing implement was the quill pen, typically made from a goose feather, though swan or crow feathers might be used for different effects. Preparing a quill was itself a skilled task. The feather had to be cured by being buried in hot sand or ash, then cut to create a flexible nib, capable of producing both fine and bold lines. A well-made quill might last through several days of writing, but constant resharpening with a small knife was necessary to maintain a clean writing edge. Ink was typically prepared within the monastery from various recipes. The most common was iron gall ink made from iron salts and tannic acids derived from oak galls growths that form on oak trees in response to certain insect larvae. When properly prepared, this ink initially appeared pale, but darkened upon exposure to air, eventually turning a deep brownish black that bonded permanently with the writing surface. Other inks, particularly coloured ones used for decoration or emphasis, might be made from various mineral or plant sources. The writing surface itself was perhaps the most precious and labour-intensive material in the entire process parchment, made from the specially prepared skins of calves' vellum. Sheep or goats, parchment was created through an elaborate process of soaking, liaming, scraping, stretching, and smoothing animal hides. A single book might require dozens or even hundreds of animal skins, making parchment extraordinarily expensive. This expense partly explains why medieval books were so valuable. A substantial illuminated manuscript might cost as much as a small farm or house. Before a scribe could begin writing, the parchment had to be prepared with guidelines to ensure even text placement. Using a pointy tool called a stylus and a straight edge, the scribe would create nearly invisible indentations marking the boundaries of text columns and individual lines. In more elaborate manuscripts, these guidelines might be drawn with lead or silver point, sometimes with red or purple ink for decorative effect. Now imagine our scribe sitting down to begin the day's work. First he reviews the exemplar, the text he is copying. Contrary to popular belief, medieval scribes didn't simply copy letter by letter without understanding. Most were highly educated and could read and comprehend the texts they reproduced, though their familiarity with the language varied depending on time period and location. A 9th century Anglo-Saxon monk, for instance, might struggle with certain Latin texts despite his training, while a 13th century university-educated scribe might read Latin almost as fluently as his native tongue. The actual writing process was remarkably slow by modern standards. A professional scribe working full-time might complete only a few pages per day. Each letter was formed individually with frequent dipping of the quill into the inkwell. Different scripts required different hand positions and pen angles. The formal book hands used for important religious or scholarly texts demanded exceptional precision and consistency, with each letter conforming to specific proportions and shapes. The physical toll of this work was considerable. Scribes frequently complained in marginal notes about sore back, strained eyes, and cramped fingers. One famous scribal complaint reads, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides. 3 fingers write, but the whole body labours." Another scribe wrote at the end of his manuscript, "Thank God it will soon be dark." Despite these hardships, many scribes took immense pride in their work and saw it as a form of devotion. For monastic scribes, copying religious texts, particularly the Bible or works of the Church Fathers, was not merely a mechanical task, but a spiritual exercise. In reproducing sacred words, they believed they were performing a service to God and to future generations of the faithful. This spiritual dimension is evident in the brief prayers scribes sometimes added at the beginning or end of texts. "Christ bless these words," or "Mary pray for the scribe," might appear in small script in the margins. Some scribes included more personal petitions. "As the harbour is sweet to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe," or "The hand that wrote this is now dust." Of course, not all copying was flawless. Errors inevitably crept in. Words misread from the exemplar lines accidentally skipped, or simple slips of the pen. When a mistake was caught quickly, the scribe might scrape away the incorrect ink with a knife and write over the scraped area. For longer omissions discovered later, text might be added in the margins with insertion marks or on small pieces of parchment stitched into the page. These errors accumulated and sometimes compounded over generations of copying, present fascinating challenges for modern textual scholars. By comparing different manuscript versions of the same text, researchers can create family trees of manuscripts, tracing which copies were made from which exemplars based on their shared errors or corrections. Beyond the basic text, many manuscripts were enhanced with decoration ranging from simple coloured initial letters to elaborate full-page illuminations featuring gold leaf and precious pigments. This work might be done by the scribe himself, if he possessed the necessary skills, or by specialized illuminators who worked in tandem with scribes. The most elaborate illuminations involved numerous stages, sketching the design, applying and burnishing gold leaf painting with various pigments, many of which were rare and expensive, and finally adding fine details with a small brush or pen. The brilliant blues derived from lapis lazuli, the vibrant reds from cinnabar or Kermes insects, and the gleaming gold backgrounds of medieval manuscripts still captivate viewers today, their colours often remarkably fresh despite the passage of centuries. Not all scribal work took place in monasteries. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the rise of universities created new demands for books, leading to the emergence of professional lay scribes and commercial scriptoria in urban centres like Paris, Bologna and Oxford. These secular book producers operated under different conditions than their monastic counterparts, working for pay rather than spiritual merit, often in more cramped quarters and frequently under time pressure from clients. Similarly, royal courts and noble households sometimes maintained their own scribes to produce administrative documents, chronicles or luxury presentation copies of popular texts like romances and historical works. These court scribes might enjoy better material conditions than their monastic counterparts, but faced different pressures to satisfy their patrons' tastes and timelines. The types of texts copied varied widely across the medieval period and between different institutional settings. Monasteries focused primarily on religious works: Bibles, psalters, missals for church services, patristic commentaries, saints' lives and theological treatises. Universities generated demand for philosophical, legal and medical texts. Royal and noble patrons commissioned histories, romances, poetry and practical works on topics ranging from hunting to astronomy. Regardless of setting, most scribes were men, though there is evidence of women scribes, particularly in convents. The Benedictine nun Diemut of Weserbrunn in the 12th century is known to have copied some 30 volumes, while the 12th century German abbess Herad of Landsberg oversaw the production of the remarkable Hortus Deliciarum, an illustrated encyclopedia containing over 300 pages. The pace of manuscript production increased dramatically over the medieval period. While early medieval scriptoria might produce only a few books per year, by the 15th century commercial workshops in major cities could generate dozens of volumes annually. This expansion reflected growing literacy among the laity, increased demand for books from universities and wealthy patrons, and more efficient production methods. By the late 15th century, the age of the manuscript was drawing to a close. Johannes Gutenberg's development of movable type printing in the 1450s would revolutionize book production. A single printing press could produce more copies of a text in a week than a scribe could create in a lifetime. Manuscripts would continue to be produced for certain luxury items and personal documents, but the mass reproduction of texts quickly shifted to the new technology. Yet the legacy of medieval scribes remains immense. Without their patient, meticulous labour, countless ancient texts would have been lost entirely. The works of Greek and Roman authors, scientific and mathematical treatises, historical accounts and early Christian writings survived to the modern era, largely because generation after generation of scribes deemed them worthy of the tremendous effort required to copy them by hand. Moreover, the aesthetic tradition developed in medieval scriptoria, the harmony of text and image, the hierarchy of decorative elements, the balance of functional legibility and artistic beauty, continues to influence book design and typography to this day. Every time we appreciate a well-designed page with its proportional margins, harmonious fonts and integrated illustrations, we are in some sense experiencing the distant echo of principles developed by those anonymous men and women who laboured with quill and ink in the quiet scriptoria of medieval Europe. As you drift towards sleep, imagine a monk in a cold stone scriptorium, his breath visible in the winter air, his fingers stained with ink, his eyes straining in the fading afternoon light as he carefully forms each letter of a text that has already survived for centuries and, thanks to his labour, will endure for centuries more. In that patient, meticulous effort lies one of history's great acts of cultural transmission, a bridge across time built by countless scribes whose names we may never know, but whose legacy surrounds us in the written word. Part 5, History of Metalworking. As the last echoes of quill scratching on parchment fade into silence, let's turn our attention to one of humanity's most transformative technological achievements, the discovery and development of metalworking. From the first hammered pieces of native copper to the sophisticated alloys that form the backbone of our modern world. The story of metalworking is a testament to human ingenuity, experimentation, and the profound ways in which materials shape civilizations. Our story begins nearly 10,000 years ago, when early human societies first encountered an unusual type of stone, one that, unlike flint or obsidian, could be hammered into new shapes without shattering. This material was native copper naturally occurring in relatively pure form in certain geological settings. In regions like Anatolia, modern Turkey, and the Great Lakes of North America, copper nuggets could be found on the ground surface or in shallow deposits, their distinctive reddish colour catching the eye of early prospectors. The earliest metal artefacts were simple items, beads, awls, small decorative objects, made by cold hammering these native copper pieces. The process was straightforward but revolutionary. By repeatedly striking copper with stone hammers, early metalworkers discovered they could flatten shape and eventually form the metal into useful objects. Unlike stone tools, which could only be shaped by removing material through knapping or grinding, metal could be deformed and reformed without losing mass. This property of malleability opened new possibilities, but early copper had significant limitations. Cold-hammered copper becomes brittle over time as the metal's crystalline structure changes under repeated impact. Early metalworkers must have noticed this problem, and through experimentation or accident, made another crucial discovery. Heating the copper before hammering made it softer and more workable, while also restoring malleability to hardened pieces. This process, which we now call annealing, involves heating the metal to below its melting point and then allowing it to cool slowly. Annealing rearranges the metal's internal structure, relieving stress and restoring malleability. The discovery of annealing, likely by the 7th millennium BCE, represented a significant advance in metalworking knowledge, allowing for the production of larger and more complex copper objects. The next transformative breakthrough came with the discovery of smelting, the extraction of metals from their ores through the application of heat. Unlike native copper, most metal in the Earth's crust exists in chemical combination with other elements forming minerals that bear little obvious resemblance to the pure metal. Copper, for instance, commonly occurs as copper sulfides or copper carbonates, appearing as blue-green or reddish rocks rather than metallic materials. The invention of smelting, which occurred sometime around 5000 BCE in the Middle East, represented a profound conceptual leap. Early metalworkers had to recognize that certain rocks contained extractable metal, develop furnaces capable of reaching sufficiently high temperatures, and master the complex chemical processes involved in separating metal from its mineral matrix. The earliest smelting operations were relatively simple. Copper ore was crushed and placed in a small clay furnace with charcoal. When ignited and supplied with air, often through blowpipes or primitive bellows, the charcoal could reach temperatures of 1200 degrees or higher, sufficient to reduce copper oxides to metallic copper, which would collect at the bottom of the furnace as a spongy mass called a bloom. This bloom required further processing, reheating and hammering to drive out impurities and consolidate the metal. The resulting copper was purer and more abundant than native copper, allowing for larger objects and more widespread use. With smelting, humans were no longer limited to rare surface finds of native metal. They could now transform seemingly ordinary rocks into valuable materials. The development of smelting coincided with another critical innovation: casting. Early metalworkers discovered that copper could be completely melted and poured into molds, allowing for the creation of objects with complex shapes impossible to achieve through hammering alone. The earliest molds were simple open forms, carved into stone, clay, or sand, producing flat objects with a molded face and a rough back. By the 4th millennium BCE, more sophisticated two-piece molds appeared, allowing for fully three-dimensional cast objects. Some of the earliest examples come from the Nahal Mishmar hoard in Israel, which contained elaborate copper maces, crowns, and scepters cast using the lost wax technique, a complex process where a wax model is coated with clay, then heated so the wax melts away, leaving a cavity into which molten metal is poured. As copper metallurgy advanced, metalworkers began to experiment with mixing copper with other elements, leading to the discovery of alloys, metallic materials composed of two or more elements. The most significant early alloy was bronze, a mixture of copper with tin, or in some cases arsenic. Bronze offered substantial advantages over pure copper. It was harder, more durable, held an edge better, and had a lower melting point, making it easier to cast. The discovery and adoption of bronze was so significant that it gave its name to an entire period of human history, the Bronze Age, which began around 3300 BCE in the Near East and spread gradually to Europe, Asia, and beyond. The transition to bronze required sophisticated knowledge and trade networks. Tin, the preferred alloying element for bronze, is relatively rare and occurs in few geological settings. Major tin sources in the ancient world included Cornwall in Britain, the Erzgebirge mountains in Central Europe, and deposits in Afghanistan and Thailand. This geographic separation of copper and tin necessitated long-distance trade, spurring the development of commercial networks that connected distant regions. Bronze production became increasingly standardized with consistent alloy compositions, suggesting careful control of the manufacturing process. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized workshops with furnaces, crucibles, molds, and tools dedicated to metalworking. These facilities produced everything from weapons and armor to tools, vessels, and ornamental objects, transforming the material culture of Bronze Age societies. The societal impact of bronze metallurgy was profound. The value and prestige of metal objects reinforced social hierarchies, with elites controlling access to weapons, luxury goods, and sometimes the knowledge of production itself. Metalworking became a specialized craft, often with religious or magical associations, and metalworkers gained significant social status. The Bronze Age also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated metalworking techniques. Metalsmiths mastered complex casting methods, including piece molds for intricate designs and larger objects. They developed specialized tools for finishing and decorating metal, hammers and anvils of different shapes, chisels for engraving, burnishes for polishing, and punches for creating textured patterns. Metalworkers also discovered techniques for joining metal pieces, such as riveting and soldering. Bronze itself could be used to join copper components through a process known as copper welding, where molten bronze was poured between two copper pieces, creating a strong bond as it cooled. These joining methods allowed for the creation of larger and more complex objects than could be cast or hammered from a single piece. The Bronze Age flourished for nearly 2 millennia across much of Eurasia and North Africa, but around 1200 BCE, a series of cultural disruptions, possibly including climate change invasions and the collapse of trade networks, led to significant changes. In this unsettled period, a new metal began to emerge that would eventually transform society even more profoundly than bronze iron. Iron is actually more abundant in the Earth's crust than copper, but it presents much greater metallurgical challenges. Iron melts at 1538 degrees, a temperature beyond the reach of ancient furnaces. Moreover, the smelting process for iron is more complex, requiring precise control of the furnace atmosphere to effectively reduce iron oxides to metallic iron. The earliest iron objects were actually extraterrestrial in origin, made from iron-nickel meteorites that fell to Earth in metallic form. These rare finds were valued for their unusual properties and often used for ceremonial objects. The famous dagger found in Tutankhamun's tomb, for instance, was made from meteoritic iron. The intentional smelting of iron from terrestrial ores appears to have begun in Anatolia, modern Turkey, among the Hittites around 1500 BCE. The process they developed, known as the bloomery process, would remain the standard method for iron production for thousands of years. In a bloomery furnace, iron ore and charcoal were layered together and ignited. Air was forced into the furnace through bellows, raising the temperature and creating a reducing environment where oxygen was drawn away from the iron oxide, leaving behind metallic iron. Unlike copper or bronze, the iron never fully melted. Instead, it formed a spongy mass, a bloom mixed with slag impurities. This bloom required extensive processing. While still hot, it was hammered to squeeze out slag and consolidate the metal. Repeated cycles of heating and hammering gradually transformed the bloom into workable wrought iron, a relatively soft, malleable metal with low carbon content. The entire process was labor-intensive and required significant skill, but it produced a metal that was more abundant and in many applications more useful than bronze. Initially, iron was not superior to bronze in all respects. Early iron was softer than bronze and more prone to rusting. However, iron had crucial advantages. The raw materials were more widely available, reducing dependence on long-distance trade, and iron could be work-hardened to increase its durability. Over time, ironworkers discovered that prolonged heating of iron in contact with carbon-rich materials could produce a harder, stronger metal. what we now recognize as steel, an alloy of iron and carbon. This carburization process was initially discovered by accident and only imperfectly controlled. Some objects might be partially steeled with a hardened cutting edge, but a softer body that was less brittle. The famous Damascus steel of the medieval Middle East and the traditional Japanese samurai swords represent sophisticated applications of these principles, creating laminated structures with different carbon contents in different areas of the blade. The Iron Age swept across Eurasia between roughly 1200 BCE and 500 BCE, though the timing varied by region. Iron's wider availability had democratizing effects. Metal tools became accessible to ordinary farmers and artisans, not just elites. Agricultural productivity increased with iron plowshares and other implements supporting larger populations and more complex societies. Ironworking techniques continued to evolve. By the medieval period, European ironworkers had developed the blast furnace, a taller, more efficient furnace that could reach higher temperatures through the use of water-powered bellows. Unlike the bloomery process, the blast furnace produced liquid iron that could be cast directly into molds. This cast iron was hard but brittle high in carbon and containing various impurities. To create more workable metal cast iron could be refined through a process called fining, where it was remelted and stirred in an oxidizing environment, burning off excess carbon. The resulting wrought iron was then hammered to remove remaining slag. This two-stage process, first creating cast iron, then refining it to wrought iron, became the standard in Europe and China, though with significant regional variations. China, in fact, had developed cast iron technology centuries before Europe, with evidence of iron casting dating to around 500 BCE. Chinese metallurgists mastered techniques for creating finely detailed iron castings, including the impressive multi-ton objects like temple bells and statuary. They also pioneered methods for controlling the carbon content of iron, effectively producing steel at an industrial scale long before Western metallurgists. The global expansion of metallurgy reveals fascinating patterns of independent invention and cultural diffusion. In sub-Saharan Africa, indigenous iron smelting traditions emerged by the first millennium BCE, developing distinctive furnace designs and ritualized production methods. In the Americas, complex metallurgical traditions focused on gold, silver, copper, and their alloys with sophisticated techniques for gilding, soldering, and creating alloys like tumbaga copper gold. The next revolutionary change in metalworking came with the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1709, Abraham Darby successfully used coke-processed coal instead of charcoal to smelt iron, dramatically increasing production scale and reducing costs. Henry Bessemer's converter, patented in 1856, introduced a method for mass-producing steel by blowing air through molten pig iron to remove impurities and control carbon content. These and other innovations transformed metal production from a craft to an industry. Metal became cheaper and more abundant, enabling the machinery, railways, bridges, and buildings that defined the industrial age. Steel, in particular, became the backbone of modern infrastructure, strong enough for massive structures yet relatively economical to produce. The 20th century saw an explosion in metallurgical knowledge and capabilities. Scientists developed a deeper understanding of metal at the atomic and crystalline level, leading to precisely engineered alloys for specific applications. Stainless steel, aluminum alloys, titanium, and countless specialized metal formulations revolutionized everything from kitchen utensils to aerospace engineering. New processing methods emerged as well. Electroplating allowed thin coatings of precious or corrosion-resistant metals to be applied to cheaper base metals. Powder metallurgy techniques enabled the creation of parts with precisely controlled compositions and properties. Computer-controlled machine tools made possible unprecedented precision in metal fabrication. Today, we live in a world shaped by millennia of metallurgical knowledge. The smartphone in your pocket contains dozens of metals and alloys, from the gold in its circuit boards to the rare earth elements in its screen and speakers. Modern buildings rise on steel frameworks while titanium alloys carry us through the skies in aircraft. Medical implants made from carefully engineered, biocompatible alloys replace worn joints and support failing hearts. Yet for all our technological sophistication, we remain connected to those early metalworkers who first hammered native copper into beads and tools. The fundamental principles they discovered, The malleability of metal, the transformation of ores through heat, the advantages of alloying, still underlie today's advanced metallurgy. When a modern jeweler anneals gold to restore its workability, or a blacksmith quenches hot steel to harden it, they are practicing techniques with roots stretching back thousands of years. The story of metalworking is quintessentially human, a narrative of curiosity, experimentation, and the drive to transform natural materials into objects of utility and beauty. From the first copper beads to the latest aerospace alloys, metals have expanded human capabilities, shaped societies, and left an indelible mark on our relationship with the material world. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the ancient metalworker sitting before a glowing furnace, watching with wonder as rocks transform into shining metal, participating in what must have seemed a nearly magical process of creation. That sense of wonder, of transformation and possibility continues to inspire metallurgists and materials scientists today as they push the boundaries of what metals can do and be in our ever-evolving technological landscape. Beyond the specific techniques and products, perhaps the most profound legacy of metalworking's history is the mindset it represents. The understanding that the world's materials are not fixed and immutable, but can be transformed through human knowledge and skill into forms never found in nature. That insight, that we can reshape matter itself to serve human needs and express human creativity, represents one of our species' most significant intellectual leaps, a foundation upon which countless technological achievements have been built across the millennia. And so, with the ringing of hammer on anvil fading into the distance, we complete our journey through these diverse chapters of human history and achievement. From the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan, to Mozart's final compositions from Aboriginal songlines to medieval scriptoria and ancient metallurgy, we've explored the ingenuity, resilience, and creativity that define our shared human story. May these tales accompany you into dreams as rich and varied as history itself.